Athens, 399 BCE. The city that once stood for freedom and reason was trembling. Not from war, but from fear. The streets buzzed with whispers. They're going to kill Socrates. He was the man who questioned everything. The man who walked barefoot through the agora, stopping strangers to ask, "What is justice? What is virtue?" And now, that same man stood accused of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. But beneath the charges, something darker hid, something political. Because Socrates wasn't just a philosopher. He was a reminder of the city's guilt. Athens was still haunted by ghosts, the Peloponnesian War. The Spartans had crushed the once great democracy. Thousands died. The empire was gone. And for a short, brutal time, 30 men ruled Athens with iron fists, the 30 tyrants. They executed hundreds, confiscated land, destroyed families, and among their ranks, Critias, one of Socrates' former students. When the democracy returned, bloodlust followed. The people wanted revenge. Every trace of tyranny had to be erased. Every voice connected to it silenced. And in the midst of it all stood Socrates, old, calm, and dangerously unrepentant. He had never taken sides, or so he claimed. But many Athenians remembered how he'd spoken well of Sparta, how he'd praised oligarchy over democracy. They remembered how his students, Critias, Alcibiades, had betrayed Athens. So, when Socrates was accused, it wasn't just about religion. It was about reputation, about power, about settling old wounds. The official charge was simple. Socrates is guilty of corrupting the youth and introducing new gods not recognized by the state. But what it really meant was Socrates made us think, and that's dangerous. He was 70 years old when the trial began, frail in body, but not in spirit. As the jurors, 500 citizens, took their seats, Socrates stood before them without a lawyer, without fear. He would speak for himself, and he would speak the truth, no matter the cost. The court was crowded. Citizens packed the Nix Hill. Some came to see justice. Others came for revenge. And some came simply to watch a legend fall. Socrates began calmly, his voice steady, almost mocking. He refused to flatter the jury, unlike other defendants. He told them, "I know that I am wise, only because I know that I know nothing." He reminded them that his mission, to question, to expose ignorance, came from Apollo himself. He asked them, "Would you rather live with lies or die for truth?" But every word he spoke made his enemies angrier. The politicians whispered. The priests frowned. Even the ordinary citizens shifted uncomfortably, because deep down they knew he was right. The accuser, Miletus, stood, a young man with ambition and nerves of steel. He had prepared this moment carefully. He claimed Socrates turned the youth against their fathers, mocked the gods, and made people lose faith in the laws of Athens. He pointed to Socrates' followers, men like Alcibiades, the traitor who once defected to Sparta, and asked, "Is this not corruption?" But Socrates dismantled him. Question after question, he cornered Miletus into contradiction, until the courtroom laughed. Then the laughter died, because Socrates, instead of begging for mercy, began to accuse Athens itself. "You fear those who ask questions," he said. "You prefer ignorance to truth. You claim to love democracy, but you kill the very thing that keeps it alive." The silence that followed was heavy. No one dared speak. Socrates wasn't defending himself anymore. He was putting Athens on trial. Yet, behind the crowd, men in power exchanged glances. These were the same politicians who had survived the terror of the 30. The same men desperate to keep their fragile democracy stable. Socrates, to them, was a spark that could reignite chaos. And that's why some historians believe his trial wasn't a matter of faith or law. It was a setup, a political act disguised as justice. Because if they could silence Socrates, they could silence dissent. As the day ended, The jurors withdrew to vote. Each would cast a pebble, white for innocence, black for guilt. And when the urns were opened, 280 black, 220 white. Socrates was found guilty. But the punishment? That was yet to be decided. And when Socrates took the stand once more, everyone thought he would plead for mercy. They were wrong. The jurors leaned forward, expecting the old man to break, to beg for his life. But Socrates smiled. He said calmly, "You ask what my punishment should be? I will tell you. I should be rewarded, given free meals for life, like a champion who brings honor to Athens." Gasps, murmurs, then rage. This wasn't humility. This was defiance. He was mocking the system that condemned him. The men who claimed to stand for democracy but acted like tyrants. The courtroom turned to chaos as Miletus and his allies shouted. Socrates stood unmoved, an island of calm amid fury. Athens had offered him a chance, a ritual moment where a guilty man could propose his own punishment. Most pleaded for exile. Some offered fines. But Socrates? He offered truth. He refused to leave Athens. "Where would I go?" he said, "where people do not speak falsely, where they do not pretend to know what they do not." The jury's anger deepened. The second vote came quickly, and the verdict sealed his fate. Death by hemlock. His followers, Plato, Crito, Apollodorus, were devastated. Plato would later write, "No evil can happen to a good man, either in life or after death." But in that moment, it felt like Athens had executed its own soul. The guards took Socrates to the prison beneath the city. A simple stone room, a narrow bed, a small window that caught the dying light. But even there, he was unshaken. He continued to speak with his students, teaching them about courage, the soul, and death. He told them, "A true philosopher practices dying, not in despair, but in wisdom." They didn't understand it yet. Not fully, but they would. Yet, in the streets, something strange was happening. Not everyone celebrated his death. Some whispered that the trial had been too quick, too clean, that Miletus had been merely a pawn, backed by more powerful men. Men like Anytus, a wealthy tanner and politician, who had helped restore democracy after the tyrant's fall. Anytus had hated Socrates. He believed the philosopher's ideas had corrupted Athens' youth, especially his own son, who had abandoned his father's trade after listening to Socratic debates. To Anytus, Socrates wasn't a harmless teacher. He was an infection, a voice that undermined the very foundations of authority. And so, when the time came to strike, Anytus saw his chance. The evidence of a setup grows clearer when you look at the timing. Athens was fragile. Its democracy had barely survived tyranny. Its faith in the gods was shaken. The city's leaders were desperate to prove loyalty to tradition and order. And here was Socrates, mocking their gods, questioning their laws, and inspiring the young to think for themselves. To them, he represented chaos. If you silence one man, you send a message to all. Plato later hinted that Socrates' trial had little to do with blasphemy. It was a political cleansing, a symbolic act meant to restore confidence in democracy. Killing Socrates wasn't justice. It was public therapy, a way for Athens to say, "We are pure again. We have learned from our mistakes." But history would prove otherwise, because what Athens really killed that day was doubt. And without doubt, democracy dies slowly, quietly. Socrates' final days became legend. Plato described how he spoke gently to his friends about the immortality of the soul, how he remained cheerful, even as the executioner prepared the poison. When Crito urged him to escape, offering bribes, ships, and safe passage, Socrates refused. He said, "Do you think that by fleeing I would live rightly? That I could live dishonorably after teaching others that one must obey the law?" He believed the law, even when corrupted, was sacred, because to break it would be to destroy what little order remained. And that, perhaps, was his greatest paradox. He died defending a system that murdered him. As the sunset bled through the cell bars, the executioner entered, carrying the cup. Hemlock, a bitter poison that slowly numbed the body from the feet upward until the heart stopped. The room fell silent. Socrates took the cup in his hands. No trembling, no hesitation. He lifted it, prayed quietly, and drank. His students wept. Apollodorus cried out. Plato turned away. Socrates smiled and said, Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. See that it is paid. Those were his last words, a riddle even to his followers. For Asclepius was the god of healing. To whom did he offer thanks? For curing him of what? Maybe life itself. Maybe the sickness of the world. Because in death, Socrates was finally free from politics, from deceit, from the city that feared its own mind. But history wasn't done with him yet. What if the trial had a deeper purpose? What if Socrates' death was more than punishment? What if it was a warning, one that echoed through centuries? Centuries later, philosophers and historians still debate what really happened in that courtroom. Was Socrates condemned for impiety or for uncovering truths Athens wasn't ready to face? Because when you study the records closely, especially Plato's Apology and Xenophon's Memorabilia, the trial reads less like justice and more like a political play. In 399 BCE, Athens was fractured. The scars of the Peloponnesian War had not healed. Democracy was fragile, built on paranoia and guilt. The people wanted enemies to blame. And then came Socrates, a man who refused to bow to convention, who embarrassed politicians in public, who questioned the very fabric of democracy. In that climate, his death became not just probable, but necessary. Let's look deeper at Anytus, one of his accusers. He wasn't just a citizen. He was a hero of the restored democracy, a man who had fought against the 30 tyrants. To him, Socrates' teachings were dangerous precisely because they made men think. Plato's writings imply that Anytus didn't act alone, that other influential voices wanted Socrates gone. His influence on the next generation, the young men of Athens, was growing too powerful. His discussions often turned followers into skeptics, questioning war, religion, and authority. In a city desperate for unity, Socrates represented division. But here's the irony. The democracy that claimed to give voice to all silenced its loudest conscience. Plato never forgave them. In his later works, like the Republic, he created a vision of an ideal state, ruled not by the many, but by the wise few. It was his revenge against the mob that killed his teacher. And so, in a way, the execution of Socrates didn't kill his ideas, it amplified them. His death became the seed of Western philosophy itself. Still, the question lingers. Was the trial orchestrated from the shadows? Evidence suggests yes. The charges of impiety were vague, crafted so that anyone could be accused. The testimonies were inconsistent. The punishment, death by poison, was unusually harsh for a 70-year-old philosopher with no criminal record. Even the timing of the trial, just before the sacred Delian festival, ensured that once the verdict was delivered, Socrates couldn't be executed immediately, trapping him in prison for weeks, giving the city time to watch him suffer. This was not justice. It was theater, and like all great tragedies, it ended with silence. The silence of a man who accepted death rather than abandoned truth. Socrates' final act, thanking Asclepius, has haunted scholars for centuries. Some believe he meant that death was a cure for the sickness of ignorance. That life, full of falsehood and fear, was the true disease. In that moment, the man condemned for corrupting the youth gave humanity its greatest lesson. That truth is worth dying for. After his death, Athens regretted what it had done. Within a few years, public opinion turned. Statues were raised in his honor. The accusers were exiled or disgraced. Anytus, according to some sources, fled the city. Miletus vanished from history, and the name Socrates, the one they tried to erase, became immortal. His student, Plato, carried his words across time. His dialogues became the foundation of philosophy, law, and logic. Yet behind every line, every idea about justice and virtue, lies a shadow, the shadow of that courtroom. Because perhaps that was Socrates' greatest lesson, that truth and power can never coexist peacefully, and that a society that punishes questions will eventually silence itself. When we look at the ruins of Athens today, the marble columns, the broken temples, it's easy to forget that beneath all the glory once stood a single man, asking a single question: what is the right way to live? For that question, they killed him. And yet, it is the very question that keeps civilization alive. Story finished